Good afternoon. My name is Ann Lockwood, and I'm one of the leaders of Resilient Cities, a nonprofit educational organization focused on advocating for greater public and private investment in climate adaptation. I'm delighted to welcome you to our webinar, New Climate Financing. And we in Resilient Cities appreciate the willingness of our expert panel to provide their experience and expertise as all of us address climate change. When we began organizing today's webinar less than 4 weeks ago, little did we realize how the pace of legislation in Connecticut would make today's topic even more timely than we had anticipated. Last week, Katie Dyke, Connecticut's Energy and Environment Commissioner, who many of you recall was a panelist during our first webinar, made an important announcement. All three of Governor Ned Lamont's legislative bills for the state's climate change agenda have received favorable committee votes and now will go to the full legislature for further consideration. Yes, you're welcome to applaud. That good news adds special relevance to the next 60 minutes, a discussion of one of those bills, a bill that authorizes a new way of funding municipal climate resilience and that also expands the work of the Connecticut Green Bank. Before we go to our panel, I'll note that we are recording this session. We will post it on our website later this week, and we'll send you an email letting you know that it has been posted. Today, I, along with my Resilient Cities colleague, Jill Sansone, will be watching the chat for your questions. We expect a lively discussion and Q&A led by our co-moderators, Stuart Mader and Alan Kratz, President of Resilient Cities. Alan has extensive experience helping communities from Maine to New Jersey identify funding for climate mitigation and resilience, and traveled frequently to Bridgeport to observe HUD's resilience planning there. Connecticut is where Stuart grew up, went to college, and began his career in education and finance. Stuart works at the nexus of climate change, transportation, and public health. Currently, he's leading a nationwide effort to ensure a vaccine equity via public transit. 450 plus transit providers in 45 states are now providing free vax transit for vaccines. Stuart.
And thanks so much. And thanks everybody for joining us. And what a nice introduction. I'm glad to be with all of you today, and I'm particularly glad to bring this panel together to talk about forms of funding, new forms of financing for resilient infrastructure. We hear so much about resilience. It's been an issue for a number of years for those of us that have lived through storms, things like Superstorm Sandy and other events that have keep reminding us of the ever-present and really the growing challenges of climate change. Getting to financing is a really important step because it means that we're moving from theory and strategy to implementation and design and construction and to the tangibles that protect our communities. And so with that, I'd like to introduce our panel starting with one of Connecticut's legislators who's helped advance Governor Lamont's climate agenda, Senator Christine Cohen. She's one of the sponsors of a bill, HB 6441, that authorizes municipalities to establish a climate resilience reserve fund. And it's funded by a transaction fee, or would be funded by a transaction fee paid by buyers of real estate. And we'll then hear from Jim Finch. He's the finance director for the town of Branford on Long Island Sound. Jim helped Branford establish a similar climate resilience fund locally, funded by property taxes rather than a proposed conveyance fee several years ago. And then we'll turn to Brian Garcia. He's the head of the Connecticut Green Bank. And the bill that Senator Cohen and her colleagues are sponsoring sets up this new environmental infrastructure fund within the nation's first green bank in Connecticut. And as Ann said, she, Jill Sansone, and Alan will be monitoring the chat. So please share your questions as you listen to the discussion. If a question pops in your mind, if you hear something in the discussion that you think, oh, I need to know a little more about that and how it might, because I'm thinking about how this might relate to my own municipality, county, state, please ask. We'll get started with the discussion, but really what we'll look forward to is the questions that you bring to the discussion. And with that, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to give us an introduction, just talk for 3 to 5 minutes about the work that you're doing, and we'll use that to set the stage for the conversation. And I'd like to start with Senator Cohen.
Thanks so much, Stuart, and thanks to Anne and Alan and Jill and everybody at Resilient Cities. I'm thrilled to be here today discussing resiliency. My name is Christine Cohen, and I'm the state senator in Connecticut for the 12th district, representing Branford, Guilford, Madison, Durham, North Branford, and Killingworth. I represent 3 coastal communities and 3 municipalities just slightly north of these shoreline towns. So as you might imagine, these discussions around resilience are particularly important to my constituency. It's something that I've been actively working on in my short tenure in the legislature. In 2019, you mentioned Jim Finch, and he'll be talking a little bit later about this. He's the finance manager in Branford. I worked with Jim and current First Selectman Jamie Cosgrove as we introduced and passed legislation that enables municipalities to create climate and coastal resiliency funds and invest them a bit more aggressively in equities to allow for shorter term growth. This year, we're looking to enable towns who create these funds to invest them through the Office of the State Treasurer, which will be an important incentive for municipalities who might not have a finance manager or a commission set up to regularly attend to these investments and make the appropriate financial decisions. This would be a cost and time-saving measure and provide resources to our towns and cities looking to be ready for sea level rise and weather events like Superstorm Sandy, but also very importantly to invest in protecting our communities from disaster. Other important legislation, as you mentioned, is HB 6441. Section 4 specifically of this bill would allow municipalities to optionally and by a vote of their legislative body establish a conveyance fee on properties over $150,000 with a graduating percentage starting at 0.5% up to 1.5% based on the purchase price of the home. It would be on the portion in excess of $150,000. So this fee could be paid by either the buyer, the seller, or shared as sort of a closing deal, if you will. The municipalities can then use these acquired monies for either the purchase, preservation, or stewardship of open space, water resources, forest land, farmland, or to fund these newly set up climate change and coastal resiliency reserve funds. These dollars could also be used for other environmental projects and programs or to repay bonds for these purposes. Excuse me. The bill also expands the purposes of municipal flood and erosion control to include climate resilience and flood prevention, rather. It would also allow for cities and towns to jointly establish boards. I'm going to take a sip of my water because I can feel I'm going to have a coughing fit.
It's allergy season. It's really indeed in full swing now.
Yes. Excuse me. So where was I? The municipal flood and erosion control boards. Adding that climate resilience piece is incredibly important to really start focusing in on resilience for our municipalities. So they could establish districts for climate resilience now, in addition to flood and erosion prevention, which are allowed for now. And also, which you'll hear from our friend Brian Garcia on the inclusion of the Green Bank and environmental infrastructure funding. So I'll let him speak to that piece. But we have some terrific things going on to shore up our coasts and help all of our towns become more resilient and adaptive to climate change. As you said, this has really become an initiative of our governor and our commissioner of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And there's so many complementary initiatives now happening at the federal level. It's become abundantly clear, I believe, to most that we need to be sustainable, thinking about renewables and green infrastructure and climate adaptation on the whole. And so we're thrilled, certainly at President Biden's rejoining of the Paris Agreement and establishing the Climate Council for rapid response. And so we're looking closely at what's going on at a federal level as well, and making sure that we're collaborating and have complementary initiatives here as well to really become more resilient on the whole. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Stuart. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, but I know that we have two other panelists that probably have lots to say as well.
Sounds good. Yes, we've got questions coming in already, which I think indicates how interested the audience is in the topic. And that's a great overview. I think it's exciting to see this much happening and to see the variety of things that are happening, both in terms of individual initiatives, but also the interplay between them. I think there's a maturity that's visible in the level of effort that's underway. So let's thank you very much. Let's do this. We'll move to Jim next for an intro from him, and then on to Brian, and then we'll jump right into those questions for all three of you.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Well, I do see there's a fair number of people from the town of Brantford in the area on the call, and I think they're looking to see if I can actually stick to talking about this subject in the 3 to 5 minutes it's allotted. So if I'm able to do that, that's probably a major kudos to Resilient Cities. But so I thought in order to try to be as brief as possible, that I would try to address really a couple questions about the Coastal Resiliency and Climate Change Reserve Funds that may be on your mind. And the questions are basically, what is a Climate Change and Coastal Resiliency Reserve Fund? Why does Brantford have it? Why did the state create it? How does it work? And whether it was difficult to put in place in Brantford. So as the senator pointed out, the fund was created through enabling legislation, PA 1977 to be specific. That's because Connecticut is a Dillon's law state, which means that it requires enabling legislation in order for municipalities to do things. It allows municipalities to accumulate dollars for climate change and coastal resiliency reserve fund projects. It's another tool that municipalities would have available in addition to traditional sources, which would be grants, bonds, borrowing money, or a pay-as-you-go strategy where you set aside dollars in your current year budget for a smaller project. So why do we have it? Well, specifically to Brantford, we're a coastline community with about 20 miles of coastline. We have a coastal resiliency plan, which outlines a variety of projects that would need to be funded. And the strategies, are what you typically might see in one of those plans: protection, accommodation, and retreat. And I think one of the philosophical underpinnings of all of this, quite honestly, is that Brantford believes that if we look at climate change and funding coastal resiliency like a long-term liability, then the best way to address a long-term liability is to start funding today, if you can, and to invest it in a way that those assets can grow to meet those future liabilities. And the law allows us, as the senator said, to invest up to 50% in equities, which provides the vehicle for that longer-term growth. And I think if you want to use a personal analogy here, is many of us at some point in our lives recognize, probably when we started our careers, that we have to save for retirement. If we have children, we recognize we have to save for college. And we all recognize that the best time to do any of those things was probably 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And so when we start today, we want to basically fund these things on a consistent basis. So in Brantford, we do use a portion of the general fund budget. We're funding about $306,000 a year. We'll have close to $2 million after the 2022 budget is adopted. And it's something that we continue to fund. And we look for ways potentially to mirror this with 6441, which we can get into later. And we also recognize that there may be opportunities for other communities to do the same. And if they're starting out on a smaller level, they may be looking to for assistance from the state, and that's where SB 971 comes in, and that specifically is to allow the state treasurer to create an investment pool and leverage sort of the economies and the logistics of that, and extend that to the various political subdivisions in the state of Connecticut. And finally, some folks recognizing that, sometimes it's difficult for government to get things done, may wonder, was it difficult for us to do this in Brantford? And honestly, I think all towns are different, but in Brantford, we've developed a culture of funding our liabilities, whether it's pension, other post-employment benefit trust, and self-insurance. So I think it was quite naturally for Brantford to take this on. And I think one of the things that you can make the argument is that, it's cheaper to do this sooner rather than later. And there's really a fiscal conservative argument for funding these things, for pre-funding liabilities. And finally, I think that you have to ask yourself two questions. And one is, why would someone not do this? And two is, I think everyone would acknowledge it's vastly better than doing nothing at all and basically putting your head in the sand. So with that, I'll turn it over to back to Stuart and be happy to answer any questions later in the program.
Jim, thanks so much. Brian?
All right. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be with you this evening. What I thought I would do is start off by introducing the Connecticut Green Bank, just to give some context from the vantage point that we come from. Second is to provide a quick overview of the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which led to a recommendation which really formed the foundation to Governor's Bill 6441 and the various section that we'll talk about in terms of expanding the scope of the Connecticut Green Bank. Just in terms of the Connecticut Green Bank, so we were actually created by a failed federal policy. So back in 2009, the American Clean Energy and Securities Act was introduced by Congressman Markey. This was also known as the Cap and Trade Bill, for those of you who followed it back then. A component of that bill had proposed the creation of what was called the Clean Energy Development Authority. That element of the bill had bipartisan support, and effectively it was a green bank at the federal level. Fast forward that story up to today, and it's likely that we're going to see this month or next month Senator Markey proposing, going back to the future and proposing the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator, which is the creation of the National Climate Bank, which was included in President Biden's American Jobs Act that he just recently announced. So lots of great history just in terms of the federal policy coming to the states, and Connecticut being the first state to have a bipartisan creation, a green bank. We're a quasi-public organization. That's to say that we use private sector disciplines to achieve public sector goals. This is our 10th year anniversary. We were created by an act of legislation, Public Act 1180, back in July of 2011. So we are coming on our 10th anniversary, and it's probably only fitting that we're looking at the expansion of the scope of the Green Bank at this point, because we know the model works. We finance clean energy. Clean energy is energy efficiency, renewable energy, zero emission vehicles, alternative fuel vehicle infrastructure. So we have a very clear statutory definition in terms of what we can enable financing towards. We're supported by Connecticut ratepayers through a combined public benefit charge. It's about $7 to $10 per family per year. That aggregates to about $25 million. We also receive allowance proceeds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, also known as RGGI, of about $3 to $5 million a year. So in total, we receive about $30 million from public sources, and our focus is to turn that $30 million into multiples more. So last year, we turned $35 million into over $300 million of investment in Connecticut's green economy. So it's all about mobilizing investment. Our mission is to confront climate change. Since our inception 10 years ago, we've invested nearly $300 million of those public resources to mobilize $1.7 billion of private investment in Connecticut's green economy. So we've enabled over $2 billion. We've helped create over 23,000 jobs in our communities. reduce the energy burden on over 55,000 families and businesses. I think we all know that by deploying clean energy in our homes, on our homes, in our businesses, on our businesses, that we can fundamentally reduce energy costs. So we do that. We reduce energy burden. We've generated nearly $100 million in state tax revenues from individual, corporate, and sales taxes for the state of Connecticut. And we're helping avoid nearly 9 million metric tons of CO2 emissions, which is the equivalent of 134 million tree seedlings grown for 10 years for those of you out there who need some equivalencies on greenhouse gas emissions. These systems also help avoid air pollution. And as you reduce air pollution, you also improve public health. So we're helping to lower healthcare costs as a result of cleaner air. And as a result of all of this, Connecticut was recognized by the Harvard University Kennedy School in 2017 with the Innovation in American Government Awards for sparking the Green Bank movement. So there are now actually more than 15 green banks at the local and state and regional level across the country. And they all come from Connecticut's birth back in July of 2011. And as I noted, we are seeing the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator in President Biden's plan and before both the House and the Senate. So we have programs for families to support deployment of clean energy. We run an incentive program where we're supporting the deployment of 350 megawatts of new solar PV in Connecticut. That will reach about 45,000 single family homes. We're nearly there. The policy is going to transition to a new structure starting January 1st of 2022. We're currently working with the utilities and the regulators to make that transition. Connecticut is a solar with justice state, which means that solar PV is now accessible by low to moderate income families and communities of color proportionately, or in some cases more so than non-low to moderate income communities. We're working on a battery storage program through an equitable modern grid proceeding that the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority is leading. So stay tuned for that for those of you who are interested in battery backup for your solar PV systems or standalone. We have financing programs with our local community banks and credit unions through the Smarty Loan, the low-income multifamily energy loan through a community development financial institution called Capital for Change, which is doing great work. And next week, we have our Green Liberty Bonds. So for those of you who are interested, I'll chat in it later. We are offering small denomination bonds for the citizens of Connecticut and people across the country to invest in solar PV and energy efficiency on our homes here in the state of Connecticut. So stay tuned for that. This is our second issuance in honor of Earth Day. We have programs for businesses where we support the deployment of clean energy through our Property Assessed Clean Energy program, a small business energy advantage program in collaboration with the utilities, and through a solar power purchase agreement where we've been working with nonprofits and local municipalities to help reduce their energy costs by deploying solar on their businesses. So the Governor's Council on Climate Change, which you probably heard from Commissioner Dykes, 23 members, public members, Department of Administrative Services, DEEP, Department of Housing, and a number of others, private businesses like the Hartford and nonprofits like Operation Fuel are all part of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. They have two committees, one on mitigation and one on adaptation. So they're embedding the Paris Agreement Foundation into the structure. And then they had 8 working groups, one around equity and environmental justice, which was great. And then another one that I helped co-chair on funding and financing adaptation and resilience. And from that working group, there were 5 recommendations on adaptation and resilience. The key top focus was ensuring that we develop and implement strategies so that no less than 40% of the funding and financing inures to vulnerable communities in our state. We want to ensure that our vulnerable communities bounce back quickly to the impacts of climate change. So we need to make sure that more investment happens in our vulnerable communities. There was a recommendation in there to include resilience within our commercial property assessed clean energy program. So Connecticut through CPACE has enabled over $185 million of investment to help businesses, manufacturers, commercial properties, retail properties, multifamily properties, nonprofits finance clean energy improvements through their property tax. And that will save those customers over $300 million in avoided energy costs as a result of clean energy deployment. So within House Bill 6571, which moved through the Energy and Technology Committee, that would expand the scope of CPACE to include resilience. That would enable us to bring in private investment to support resilience projects. Then, of course, we've got House Bill 6441, which Senator Cohen so awesomely moved through the Environment Committee. There's an element of that bill that speaks to the expansion of the scope of the Connecticut Green Bank. Essentially, it does a couple of things. As I noted earlier, the Green Bank is defined by a clean energy definition. So that's kind of the playing field that we can currently operate in. By broadening our scope to include environmental infrastructure, we can now support structures, facilities, systems, services, and improvement projects that are related to water, waste and recycling, climate adaptation and resiliency, agriculture, land conservation, parks and recreation, and environmental markets, including carbon offsets and ecosystem services. So you can see how broad of a definition we have, and moving the Green Bank to include beyond clean energy, environmental infrastructure is not new. For all those other states that were creating green banks, and those countries, in fact, Australia, the UK, that have green banks within them, they are also already doing environmental infrastructure. So the model works for environmental infrastructure. It would also create an environmental infrastructure fund that clearly would restrict the use of the clean energy fund that I mentioned before and the RGGI allowance proceeds only to clean energy. So any source of funds that come to the environmental infrastructure element of our mission would have to be through raising bond funds or through federal funds, the Clean Energy and Sustainability Accelerator that I talked about before. So we have an eye on those federal resources and are advocating for the approval of those resources to come to Connecticut. It would also address our bonding capacity, allowing for the maturity or the term on the bonds to be for no more than 25 years when it comes to clean energy, which is for the most part the useful life of solar PV. The bonds can't be longer than the useful life of those measures. And then in terms of environmental infrastructure, it would allow up to 50 years in terms of the maturity of those bonds. You can imagine things like renovating our old and aging dams, that these are long-term infrastructure types of projects. So we need to be able to issue bonds that would support those investments over the useful life of those measures. It would also increase our special capital reserve fund from 100 million to 250 million. This would allow us to take advantage of the good and improving bond rating of the state of Connecticut. So you will in fact see, if you go to greenlibertybonds.com, I will chat that in a second, that we are using the SCARF, the state backing, for our A-rated climate bond certified bond that we're issuing next week. So quick overview of the Green Bank and our legislation on environmental infrastructure.
Stuart, you're muted. There you go.
There we go. I'm sorry, I was muted. Brian, thank you. That was a great overview. Got a number of questions to jump into on resilience. Before we do that, one quick one that came in from the audience on, just because you were talking about solar. Question is, what's the status of, if you know this, state legislation to enable solar energy in homeowner association, HOA governed communities? Do you happen to know?
So broadly, I think right now, the homeowner associations, given the rules, define whether or not solar can be provided. I don't think there is a preemption of those rules. I'd have to check, but I don't believe there is. But where the state is moving to a new tariff starting January 1st of 2022 will be encouraging of multifamily types of properties, condo properties, by utilizing a tariff-based structure. So stay tuned. You could imagine solar with battery storage being an important option for those communities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, excellent. I appreciate everybody giving the overviews. I think there was a lot of great information in there. I'm going to start with a couple of quick questions, and we've got a number coming in from the audience as well. So first one I want to ask about, related to 6441. talk a little bit, and I think this question probably goes to Senator Cohen, but anybody, please feel free to jump in on this one. Can you talk a little bit more about the process for a municipality after that bill were to pass and be signed into law? Does each municipality would then, my basic understanding is each municipality would then need to adopt a conveyance fee in their municipality by a vote of their governing board. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure, Stuart. Yeah, and that's absolutely correct. So this is enabling legislation that allows the municipalities to go ahead and put before their legislative body, whether it be town council or board of selectmen type government, to put that to a vote or referendum, however they do it. So that would have to go through their legislative body and pass, and then they can determine the best structure as well. So there'll be allowance for, we've been talking about allowing different fee structures. Obviously this legislation is early on in the process. We did get it out of the Environment Committee, of which I am the Senate chair. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, which is why I'm here. But it, it does still have a long way to go. We need to get it out of the House and the Senate and onto the governor's desk for signature. And there is some pushback on it, and particularly pushback on this section. And so there's a lot of talk about how best to structure it, and whether it be and initially was presented as a buyer's conveyance, recognizing that a buyer would be living and benefiting from reaping the benefits of this fund in a particular municipality. But negotiations presented it as either a buyer or seller's conveyance, or something that could be shared between the two to make it a little bit more palatable and affordable in the transaction.
Great. And that actually leads right into my second question, which is when municipalities, so because it's enabling legislation and you're working on the structure, assume that the bill passes with the structure roughly the way it's laid out, with the 800,000, 2.5 million, and so forth. Does a municipality have flexibility within that to say, well, we want to adjust that a little bit for our municipality? We might want to set the threshold at 900,000, or we might want to set the percentage at, instead of 0.5% at, an 1/8% or 3/8% or something. Is there flexibility for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, right now, obviously there's a floor, so you absolutely, the way it's written, you not charge a conveyance fee on anything $150,000 or lower. And as I said, we've been talking a little bit about allowing for some movement on the structure of the fee structure, so that municipalities could in fact vary the rates if they would want to. Right now, it is set at 150,000 to 800,000. It would be 0.5%. 800 to 2.5 million would be 1%, and over 2.5 million would be 1.5%. So that's the way it is structured right now. But again, there is some talk about changing and allowing for some flexibility.
Gotcha. Okay, that's very helpful. And then one other question that came in from the audience is another question about the bill. And I'll read the question. The audience member asked, in reading the bill, it looked like there was a caveat on using the funds for open spaces if a municipality did not meet certain housing requirements. Can you explain those restrictions?
Sure. Well, we have in Connecticut our statute 830G, which is an affordable housing requirement of 10%. And there are not many municipalities, quite frankly, that meet that 10% requirement, by the definition of affordable housing. Most of them are urban centers. They are, we probably have about 30, I believe, on the list or so at last check. And so those are the only municipalities that could procure open space with this fund. They can do everything else outlined in the bill, including resiliency programs, but they would not be able to procure open space. The reason for that is there's some concern that there would be, the want or, desire of some of the townspeople to procure open space, pushing out some affordable housing projects. And so that was the thought behind that piece of legislation.
Makes
I
sense.
just
That's
want to mention, I know, and I'll follow up on what Brian said in terms of the solar. We do separate out our energy and technology committee, but there is, I'm not aware of any statute that prohibits solar in those homeowner associations. So if that person, I know that this has come up before, and so we've had discussions in the legislature about whether or not we should be making some movement on that, but I'm not aware of any statute. So if somebody wants to point to something on that, I'd be happy to do a little bit more research, but it's my understanding that they could certainly go through, a community solar program or something like that. But just in follow up to that question, I don't think there's any legislation right now on allowing, specifically allowing homeowners associations to permit solar because I don't think that our statutes prohibit it.
That's very helpful. Thank you. And then just another one on the structure of the bill. The section that talks about the conveyance fee talks about real property. It's not specific, and I think probably for good reason, not specific on types of transactions. And my sense of that is that's to be inclusive of both residential and commercial transactions. Is that my interpretation right on that?
Yeah, I mean, right now it exempts the fee conveyances that preserve open space, farm or forest land in perpetuity, and it also existing law exempts those that have real estate taxation. So like deeds between spouses to secure that, or corporate mergers, things of that nature would be exempt. But otherwise, all else goes.
Gotcha. That's helpful. I'm thinking in terms of when municipalities put this up for a referendum, they need to sell it to constituents. That may be a question that comes up: is this a tax only on residential, or is a business that's coming into town? Presumably, I'm thinking of a larger business, a larger real estate transaction. That could obviously, a conveyance fee on that could obviously have a pretty significant impact on generating resiliency funds.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good. I want to turn to Jim for a couple of quick questions that have come in. One, Jim, is a little bit more of a general question. An audience member asked, what do you see as a way for more towns and cities to set up their own local coastal resiliency funds?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. I think there's a couple things that are kind of addressed in 6441. One is, let's just refer to it generally as ease of administration, right? So how can somebody set one of these up? Well, Connecticut has put a law in place to allow that to happen. The second is a lot of communities are resource constrained. And so there might be a resistance to levy taxes to fund these things, unlike what we did in Brantford. But 6441 addresses that through the creation of the real estate conveyance fee, which can then go into the Coastal Resiliency Fund, which was established by PA 1977. And then the third thing is, they may not have a local pension plan. They may be part of a state pension plan, and they may be intimidated, unwilling, or there may be some friction in terms of creating the investment vehicles. And again, we look at what Connecticut's doing legislatively, Senate Bill 971 solves that problem too by having the state take the lead on that and distributing it out to the political subdivision. So if you kind of look at the laws that have been passed to date and the laws that are proposed, I think it solves that problem. Again, you have the vehicle on a local level, the enabling legislation. You have a funding mechanism through the real estate conveyance tax, and you have the state treasurer, if SB 971 is passed, partnering with you to invest those dollars and take some of that stress off the local municipality.
Makes a lot of sense. And then can you talk a little bit more about the differences from your view, looking at this from the town perspective on Branford's existing fund versus what's proposed in the bill at the state level? And another sub question on that is Branford's fund specifically just for climate resilience, or can it be used for resilience infrastructure that's not absolutely specific to climate change resilience?
Sure. There's a lot to unpack there. Let me go back and deal with
Sure.
the issue as to how this 6441 bill would impact Branford. And again, I'm speaking theoretically. I've actually looked at this. I've modeled some of this. But I know there's a lot of folks from Branford on the call, so I don't want them to take this and say, well, Jim, you said at this conference that we're going to do X, Y, and Z. But this is all basically kind of analysis that we did. I went back and I looked at the last 24 months of qualified sales in Branford, and I applied the legislation as I understand it, the various bend points in there, 150,000, 800,000, over 2.5 million, et cetera. In Branford's case, based on the last 24 months, that would yield a little over $500,000. And what I think one of the more powerful components of 6441 is the fact that you can use these dollars to fund bonds issued for resiliency projects. And so looking at that, I said, well, how do we leverage this in a place like Branford? How do we use our Coastal Resiliency Fund 6441, and how do we leverage this going forward? And I modeled a scenario where the town of Branford could do a resiliency project for $17 million, okay? And let's assume FEMA was reimbursing at 65%. It's generally 75, but there may be an eligible cost. And we issue taxable bonds, so we don't have all the restrictions that municipalities have when they issue tax-exempt bonds. And we modeled this out using taxable rates. The long and short of it is that Branford could do a $17 million project, and it wouldn't fund any new mill rate tax levy dollars other than the 306,000 that we're currently doing, which I mentioned earlier. So that means just doing what we're doing with 6441 with our estimated real estate conveyance fees under the present law, and I discounted that by 80% because it's a hot real estate market, and we earn 4.5% on the proceeds, leveraging SB 971. So if you tie this all together, like I said, the town of Branford could basically do a $17 million project in theory without any new additional tax levy dollars other than the level it's currently doing. So if I sound excited about this, I apologize. I probably am, but I'm trying to look at ways to leverage this, and I think that in Branford's case, there's a potential there, and it'll be something I'll probably be discussing with the Board of Finance and the RTM and folks of those groups, waiting to see if the legislation gets passed. And I apologize, I forgot what the second part of the question was.
The second part of the question was specific to Branford's existing fund. Is it only for specifically for climate resilience?
Yeah, basically, when the fund was created, the rationale was that we would use it to fund items typically outlined in our coastal resiliency plan. So there's a whole host of items listed in that plan. And as I think I said at the beginning, it varies from different strategies: protection, accommodation, retreat. So there's various strategies. I should point out that we just can't spend that money. The way we set it up in Branford was that if we were going to use those dollars, or when we use those dollars specifically, we would go through the same appropriating process that we do as our regular budget. So in Branford, an appropriation most likely request would come from the First Selectman's office. Would go to our Board of Finance. Our Board of Finance would make a recommendation to the RTM, and then the RTM would approve a project which could be funded through the Coastal Resiliency Fund.
Got it. Very helpful. And so Jim, thank you. That's a lot of great information. Brian, I want to ask you a similar question to the question Jim just answered, which is kind of from the Green Bank perspective. How do you look at this enabling legislation, 6441, the funding streams that it would create? How do you look at that vis-a-vis the existing funding programs within the Connecticut Green Bank?
Great question. And Jim, I get excited when I hear you talking about the conveyance fees. You know, it's one of the things we all know is that our communities are going to come up with these solutions to climate, right? And just seeing what Brantford's done and what Jim has done is really innovative. And the more we can enable our communities and our citizens to think about these solutions, the more we're going to attack the problems. So in terms of our expansion, you know, there are a number of different things that environmental infrastructure includes, right? So we could envision urban farming as an agricultural thing to try to address food deserts in urban environments. We could envision bringing more anaerobic digesters to helping address our food waste and our farm waste kind of issues. So there are a number of different things within that definition that make sense. On the resiliency and adaptation side, you know, we're trying to learn to understand how, if we provide bonds to support projects like Jim is speaking about, a $17 million project with the different capital structure that is proposed, how we could, you know, one, enable the lowest cost capital to go into those projects. You know, if the towns need that. Towns may already be AAA, but to the extent there are state resources or federal resources that can improve that, great, our towns will benefit. But we really, you know, need to try to understand all the different types of resiliency and adaptation projects that can be supported. And, you know, we're not a general obligation bond issuancer. You know, we would be a revenue bond issuancer, which is to say that the projects need to pay back in some way. We're not like the state of Connecticut where we can have tax revenues pay off the bond. So we really need to work hard to identify those areas of the market where we can be of assistance to municipalities in addressing their adaptation and resiliency needs. So still to be determined. That, you know, I would say that, you know, if the policy 6441 passes in June, that we're going to have to spend, you know, 6 to 12 months really thinking about and talking to municipalities about how we can enable our tools to support environmental infrastructure improvements within their respective jurisdictions. There will be programs that we currently have, like the Smarty loan with our local community banks and credit unions, where we'll just be able to tell them, you know, if let's include resiliency in those list of measures that you can support, wells, you know, water, you know, the like. We can now do it all, and we'll use our balance sheet as a second loss reserve to support your lending to households in that space. Or if CPACE passes, we can provide capital to businesses and institutions who want to do resiliency projects. So, you know, a lot pending what happens this legislative session.
Excellent. There's a lot of runway ahead for this. I think that's what's really exciting. Let me ask you one other question, and I'm coming at this from my in a past chapter of my career. I spent some time in the rating agency world, commercial credit rating agency, Fitch. And so I wonder, from your perspective, from the Green Bank perspective, how do you see the fixed income markets reacting to this kind of take what you're doing now and then layer onto it? Think about states, you know, like Connecticut leading the way on this, and then as this potentially grows out, we see more states creating this as a funding stream. How do you see that? How do you see the bond markets, the fixed income markets, looking at that?
So great question. You know, I would suggest if you're interested, take a look at greenlibertybonds.com and look at our S&P rating. We've got the recent S&P ratings of the bond on there. A couple of interesting things. One is they are beginning to address whether or not states are addressing climate. In the extent we're focusing on mitigation and adaptation. So that's interesting from a rating perspective. So we're starting to see that, which is important to the rating of debt. The second thing I guess I would say is that, you know, this is based on last year's issuance. I can't tell you where the markets are going to settle on this until Earth Day, when the market opens up the bidding price. And again, citizens can bid into that. But looking at last year, Treasury rates, as we know, were significantly down last year, right? And the market was unstable as a result of COVID. So the yields for a 15-year bond, a Green Liberty bond, I believe was 2.6%. So it was low. But we've now the rates have come up and adjusted a little bit. So I suspect as we look at on Earth Day this year that we're going to see the yields higher for these fixed income securities, these green Liberty bonds, which, you know, we had modeled the green Liberty bonds off of the war bonds in the 1940s. And, you know, those were 2.99% interest rate for a 10-year term. And they were zero coupon bonds, which essentially meant that if you bought them for $75, you received $100 10 years later. So, you know, depending on where they settle next week, you know, we're kind of within a Series E war bond-like environment. And we designed the program specifically to enable citizens, because we have a democracy where people can get out and vote vote in great elected officials who lead on the issue of climate. But we also are in a mixed economy. And to the extent we can develop capitalistic tools to enable citizens to invest in climate, we're going to do that. And that's what the Green Liberty Bond is all about. So I would invite everyone to take a look and you know, support us now on mitigation, and eventually we'll get to adaptation too if 6441 passes.
That's great. And I think you're right. It's part of it is seeing how the market reacts. And I think another angle on it is we're, at least from what I see, the rating agencies are taking resilience and adaptation. It's becoming more central to the assessment of risk. It's not there yet, and certainly not in all sectors, but it is, when I look at it now versus 5 years ago, 8 years ago, it's much more central than it was before. It's no longer really seen as a fringe kind of a nice to have. It's becoming part of the need to have calculation. Good. Well, I'm going to bring it back over to Senator Cohen for another question. And this is a question, and Jim, maybe for you too as well, thinking about Branford's fund. A question came in from the audience. Would the resilience conveyance fee be applied in municipalities? Would it be applied townwide, or would it be applied to coastal districts or to shoreline properties? I think there are two ways of looking at that question. One is, I think the person may be asking, would sales in those particular areas be assessed and other areas not be assessed the fee? Another way to look at it is, would the fee be assessed everywhere, and would funds then be designated to be used in particular districts?
Yeah, so I would say the way the legislation is written right now, the fee would be applied to any home sale in the entire town where they decided to implement a conveyance fee. But you know, to follow up the latter part of what you just said, Stuart, you're absolutely right. A town may decide that they're using those funds to shore up the coastline, or to, you know, build some sort of infrastructure, or, you know, look, you know, maybe there's a berm or something of that nature, living shoreline project, what have you. So, you know, maybe, you know, perhaps the bulk of the funds goes to the shoreline, but we're really talking about resiliency on the whole. So, you know, we're talking about inland towns, and what are we doing? Not just the coastal towns were impacted by Superstorm Sandy, for example. You know, towns across the state were impacted by that storm. And we really need to be thinking about that. Many of our towns have waterways. Many of our towns are not planning appropriately for climate change and adapting. So, you know, we need to be talking more about this with our inland locations as well, not just our shoreline.
I think you bring up a really important point. It's easy to look at the coastal part of resiliency. It's the obvious. We see the water flowing in. We see, you know, viscerally when we have storms, we see the pictures of beach erosion and things like that. And we see kind of obvious solutions to that, building berms, relocating properties inland, you know, within coastal communities. But you're exactly right. There's a bigger question, which is, how do we make sure we're preparing inland communities for, you know, not just the sea level rise part of it, the sort of the water part of it, but what happens when you take a small community that might be relatively sparsely populated and not quite prepared for the infrastructure burdens of people moving away from the coast? And again, not to say that everybody's going to leave the coast, but some people may choose to say, you know, I want to move a little further inland, a little further upland. What does that do to a town that might not otherwise be anticipating that influx, and how can they better prepare?
Right, and what does climate change mean, right? It means warmer temperatures, right? We're seeing a lot of 90+ degree days consecutively. We're seeing heat waves of that nature. How is that how does that impact air quality? What is that doing to our inland communities? And so those are the types of projects and things we need to be thinking about as we move forward. So that's why this is not only a coastal resiliency reserve fund, but specifically named climate change and resiliency fund. So I think that's an important point.
It's the holistic macro view, and it's the enabling. It's in a lot of ways, the legislation is the infrastructure to enable the infrastructure. It's the political infrastructure to then create the tangible physical adaptation infrastructure.
That's right.
Well, this has been great. We are coming up on the end of time. We've just got a couple minutes left. That's all the questions that have come in. So what I'd like to do is just ask each of you if you have a closing thought you'd like to share, anything in particular you'd like to point the audience to for more information. Now would be a good time to share it.
Well, since I'm off mute already, I'll start and just want to thank you again for hosting this today. I think it's so important that we're discussing resiliency and raising awareness, and to the extent that all of the participants here can sort of spread the word on this legislation. We can use all the support we can get on it, making sure that it passes that proverbial finish line. So both Jim and Branford and Brian at the Green Bank can employ these strategies and help make our communities more resilient going forward. So again, just thanks for having us, and I'm always available. I can actually type my email address in the chat box if anybody wants to reach out with specific questions. Happy to answer them anytime.
Great, Senator Cohen, thank you. Jim?
Okay, I'm going to leave you, I think, with 3 quotes because I think it kind of underscores some of the attributes of dealing with these issues. And the first is from Arthur Ashe, which is start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. I think that's a good example of what we're trying to do here and in Branford. And then again, in terms of needing sort of that push, to sort of the altruistic aspect of it, is there's an ancient Greek proverb which says, a society grows great when its older citizens plant trees under whose shade they know they will never sit in. And so some of the things we're doing today are going to benefit generations down the road. And then the last one is a Chinese proverb, which says, the creation of 1,000 forests is in one acorn. Today's mighty oak is just yesterday's nut that held its ground. And they're not talking about me, they're talking about a plant. The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So those are my 3 quotes that I'll leave you with.
Thank you, Jim. Brian?
Funny, Jim, that was good. 2 weeks ago, President Biden proposed a $2.2 trillion American jobs plan. So if you think about the Green Liberty Bond structure that I talked about, the Series E war bonds, back in the 1940s, over 85 million Americans bought over $185 billion worth of bonds to support the effort to combat Nazi Germany. $185 billion in today's dollars is $2.5 to $3 trillion of investment. So imagine what we could do if we enable citizens to invest in their government to confront climate change. That is at the heart of what a Green Liberty Bond is. And we can do it. We are learning from each other here in Connecticut. And I just want to say thank you to all of you on the front lines in our communities who are making it all happen. So thank you all.
I want to thank the 3 of you, Senator Christine Cohen, Jim Finch from the town of Branford, and Brian Garcia from the Connecticut Green Bank. Thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your experience, your expertise, and most importantly, the work that you're doing on behalf of your communities. We thank you. Take care, everyone.